hopefully fruitful discussions in the different groups, including the Media and Communications group, which I understand also was very interesting. So we now are going to start the multi-stakeholder dialogue on the tools of implementation. And to start this session today, first of all, what we are going to do is to ask the theme coordinators and the regional sessions coordinators to start giving us their feedback about what they have heard from all of you in the different sessions and what they think has been more important for their work and for the work we are doing in the United Nations. So please, I will ask Joaquin, you are going to chair these meetings, so please come to the podium, and maybe we ask our other colleagues to do that too.
Is on, right? Good morning, everyone. If anybody here feels like Thomas Chiramba, you're welcome up on the stage, on the podium here. Rudolf, do you feel like Thomas Chiramba? No? Okay. We'll see if anybody who is or feels like Thomas Chiramba pitches. He will soon come. Right. So what we have in front of us now is that we have a number of colleagues and friends here that have been listening in with a hat on of being a thematic, you could say, observer, coordinator, or also listening in from a perspective of a region. So what we have as a title now is Implementation Challenges. We can just think about that a bit, implementation challenges. And also lessons learned on the main themes of the water-related SDGs. So the question I have to you, and I'd like each of you to spend about five minutes around there, to share from your thematic perspective or from your regional perspective what you've picked up as important points, lessons learned related to these implementation challenges. And to get us started, I thought maybe, Jean-Marc, you could kick this off, and maybe, and you're wearing a hat here now related to water scarcity and water resources management. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Joachim, and good morning, everybody. Indeed, yesterday I spent the whole day with my water scarcity, water resource management hat, going from one meeting to the other. And I must say it's very interesting to be given this task, to look at different groups and how they address the same problem. Very early in the day, we started with governments, and immediately the chair introduced the fact that we have to look at water scarcity through different lenses and different dimensions of water scarcity. And I think we are very familiar all with that, but it's always very interesting to remind ourselves this is not just a question of is there enough water, but it's an institutional question, a governance question, an economic question, a technical question, etc. So because scarcity has so many dimensions, also the answer are so many and diverse, and we obviously often need combinations of actions. I'll not report on group by group, because what I think is interesting is how what I heard from one group and from other groups can be compared. As somebody coming from agriculture, I was very happy and not surprised to see that in all groups agriculture was central to the debate. But a lot of progress was done, because if usually in water agriculture is seen rightly as the number one user and the culprit of all problems, now because there is a much better understanding that everything is connected in our development world, we cannot anymore look at a topic, a subject through a single lens. And the fact that in a system, in our system, if you modify one element of the system, everything will be modified. There is a much more interesting for us discussion about how to engage with agriculture and not just make them waste less and pay their water, which is obviously part of the solution but not the whole solution. I also heard a lot, and that's probably due to the fact that how the meeting was organized, the long discussion about technology and governance, and one group, I think it was the academics, said, well, really, these two things have to get together. And of course, if there is still a lot of room for technology, hydraulic technology. I mean, we have great examples here in Spain of how technology is fundamental to address water scarcity. We also have much more work in information management technologies. And then I heard in the first group, in the governance group, tecnología social. And I love that. And I think this really is something that, this was in the case of the Brazilian Agua Boa Itaipu example, very interesting, how much they have invested in the social. And this came all across the discussions. And of course, the famous stakeholder engagement that we are all now familiar with came time and again. But we went into, I didn't speak, I listened, they went into it in details. And they acknowledged this is easy to say, but very difficult to do. And if you mention a challenge, I think very clearly from different groups, the complexity of stakeholder engagement is important. And part of it is probably due to the fact that different groups talk completely different languages. I had the opportunity to see that because in the first group on government, there was a very interesting presentation on how Myanmar is getting organized in terms of laws and plans and programs for addressing water scarcity. And in the next group, it was civil society. And I got also from Myanmar a completely different way of looking at the same problem. They share the idea that there is a problem, but they speak in a completely different language. So that for me was really interesting. But I also had to live this problem of taking the same language when I end up in the business group. Because then I, with my technical background, I really had to listen very carefully to understand. It was in English, and there were words that I could recognize, but it's really a difficult and a completely different language for me. So really, I learned what it means talking to stakeholders you are not used to talk to. And actually, this was, in that group, it was also discussed, because, for instance, on an example about green bonds, the presenter showed how one of the big challenges was to have the experts that they use to decide what could be considered a green bond. A green bond, if I understood, is something where you invest in climate-resilient enterprises. And there are experts who have to explain what is or not resilient to businessmen. They have a hard time understanding each other. Business people need simple, robust, and low transaction cost solutions, and experts have a hard time explaining exactly that it is very complicated. So the key word is listen, but the only word I had in each group is trust, and sometimes mistrust. And I think this is very much related to the stakeholder engagement, the listening, the difficulty, and the time that it takes. It was the case for Water Use Association in Myanmar. It was the case, I mentioned it, for Agua Boa in Brazil, for drought preparedness plan that we heard about in academic group, and for the green bonds that I just mentioned. So these are my take-home messages, and for somebody in FAO, we've also get prepared for SDG, of course, and sustainable agriculture we are working on, and stakeholder engagement is central to this. But I felt like this is going to be a very interesting challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Marc. This was quite intriguing, I think. I mean, if you think about it, before you came here, and you were going to listen to a summary of what are the key points for and the implementation challenges related to water scarcity and water resources management. And the key word is listen. Okay, we have to listen, and we have to address trust and mistrust. I thought that was quite interesting. So the people and how we interact between ourselves as stakeholders is very central. But before I pass the mic to my next candidate here, which is John Harding, I just want to hear just a few points. You said technology and ICT, information technology especially also, were mentioned as important and part of maybe the solution to address the implementation challenges. Could you just say a few words of what you picked up in terms of advances or potential when it comes to technology and ICT?
Yes, I think there were very interesting examples on how in some, you know that in many places Spain is a very water scarce country, using a lot of its resources, and this requires a battery of investments in how you manage your water, from the classical storing it in the dam, distribution, water desalination, and from that presentation that's where I got this idea there's not one single solution but a combination of solutions. And then ICT indeed is bringing a lot of new knowledge, new tools that allow you to better manage your water in real time. So these two types of technology combined can really help you stretch to the limit in terms of how you manage your water.
Okay, thank you very much, Jean-Marc. Now, from water scarcity, if it becomes really scarce, extremely scarce, then we're talking about a disaster, and that leads us into the area of risk management. So, John, you've been listening in on that, so could you share some of your insights?
Thank you, Joaquin, and good morning to all of you. So I basically followed all of the stakeholder group discussions on this intersection between water resources, water sanitation, disaster risk management, and climate change adaptation. And I think the overall message that came out from all these discussions was that this challenge requires the engagement of all the stakeholders, and this message came out from each one of the individual groups, which I think is encouraging. There was a very rich and diverse discussion, actually, when you think about it across the groups. If you start from the perspective of the corporate sector, that we had presentations by IDB on the initiative that deals with climate and smart climate and agriculture, looking at promoting resilient business models in Jamaica, and also a case of looking at a carbon disclosure project. And the discussions there that really looked at what are the challenges of that within the corporate sector of making a business case in a context of uncertainty, in an area where you're going to have to look at long-term returns. Interestingly, they presented. They say that people or communities are going to be impacted through private enterprises. If when a drought affects a country, it will impact agricultural production or energy production, and that will result in an increase in food prices or power cuts for the people. But I think that this notion of water stewardship came out very strongly from those discussions. The risk cannot be managed by the private sector alone. It's something that, if we're talking about water effectiveness, resilient supply chains, managing the risk of disasters, a business will only be as resilient as, say, as the river basin organization in which of that area, or the resilience of the community. And I'd very much encourage you to, if you're interested in those discussions, to follow up with Paul Reig from WRI, who facilitated those discussions. A very rich discussion in the civil society group with cases from Pakistan, Europe, Burkina Faso, Bangladesh, Syria. I think the commonality of a lot of the discussions in the civil society around these topics, there was a lot of talk around the need for dialogue, awareness, empowerment, gender, youth, and all of these cases. I felt, if you're talking about technology transfer for farmers in Syria or early warning systems in Bangladesh, they all found that this stream of climate change adaptation as a useful opportunity. We're talking about implementation. Climate change adaptation is something that they feel it can actually, support this need for doing things differently. And I think probably development is still a hard nut to crack. But there they actually have an opportunity for changing perceptions and moving forward. The academics, they spoke about risk governance and the role of countries. But that's good because when the governments, they talked about scientists and the science needs to drive decision making. So I'm certain they're going to have a pretty good dialogue later in the day when they discuss together. There was some good cases presented by the Dutch government. We heard about a monitoring project in the Mediterranean, a river basin organization, the Rhine. And here, I think it reconfirms if you want to find good practice experience built up over many years, you really find it within the national and local institutions. They have a real strong understanding on how to inform, communicate, how to learn, use lessons, understand risk to climate change, but also many other factors, urbanization. We're building more and more assets in high-risk areas. And they also discuss this notion of co-benefit. If you develop a flood management strategy, it can also help to provide safe water supply, protect ecosystems, so a knock-on effect. And maybe just to wrap up, I think there was a very strong call across all the stakeholder groups. They were saying this need for coherence when we're talking about water, disaster risk reduction, climate change, sustainable development. And there was even one of the governments said that they would really like to see in 2015, for them the ideal is if by the end of this year we have a consistent set of targets and goals across all of these agendas. I'm certain that's, Joachim, is something that would be music to your ears. So thank you.
Well, I hope it's music to all our ears. It just reminds me of the hydrological cycle, actually, because we cannot just look at one part, and taking the cycle as such. I also mean how water flows through all our economies, societies, in different forms and ways, and it is connected. Now, you said here that you said climate change adaptation. It's an opportunity, it's a tool, and also that there's a need for this coherence. And that just reminds me about the way that the Open Working Group right now has put its targets, with the target for water-related risks not being in the water goal, but now under goal 11. So it somehow speaks against what we just said, the need here to use it as, you could say, an integrating factor, and also the need for coherence. Do you have any reflections on that? Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, I think there are two notions here. First, when because they're talking about coherence, and so if we're talking about, so we need coherence between the way we as institutions or countries in stakeholder groups address disaster risk and climate change adaptation. So that's the first level of coherence that's going to be required here. So I think there was some very, it was interesting to hear people, like, they kept saying, adapting to climate change is a long-term strategy for managing risk, or they'd say it the other way around. Another group would say managing risk is an effective and practical way of adapting to climate change. So really making those linkages. But to come back to your point, and the second need for coherence is looking at this in the broader context of sustainable development. We know these are principles that are going to have to drive a lot of these sectors and areas of engagement. And you can probably make quite a strong case that water is one of the most relevant areas if you're talking about climate change, climate risk, disaster risk. And so it has to be anchored within the work within the water environment, and that is also going to be, if you're talking about coherence, that is going to be a very important aspect.
Thank you very much, John. So I'd like now to move on to another thematic area, and this is the area of water supply, sanitation, and hygiene. So Natalie and Jose, you've been covering that theme. So over to you.
Thanks. I think we are going to share a couple of reflections, myself and Natalie. So when I was preparing for this event, Josefina gave me the voice on the first day to talk about some of the things, and it was expected that we could talk about the tools that we have in the water sector, and also that we could talk a little bit about the baseline and some of the challenges already. And I thought that was a good opportunity to put already in my mind a couple of bullet points or challenges that I even shared on the first day that I thought could help me also during the second day, and now to report back on maybe seeing how the discussions among the different stakeholders were going about these points. So just to recap, on the first day of my presentation, those considerations for the implementation of the SDGs in WAS that I mentioned were the first part was around financing and the need to secure, absorb, and target sustained international and national financing. Then I also mentioned, as it was shown in my slides, the need to really refocus our commitments on rural areas, because we've seen that those unserved in many cases remain in rural areas. I also mentioned the issue of sustainability, which we've seen during the implementation of the MDGs. That is a key issue, and we know for sure it's going to be a key issue during the implementation of the SDGs. And then kind of two new areas, which is the taking WAS beyond the households and then taking to institutions such as schools and health centers, which is going to be very much a discussion that it's coming. And I know that Natalie is very much willing to make some points around something that I also mentioned, which is the need to strengthen the edge of the WAS, which is the hygiene. So said that, what I did yesterday is, after running through all the sessions, which was really interesting with all the stakeholders, I think all the sessions were really, really good. What I did is I went home and then I checked a little bit all my notes, trying to capture, as John has done, rather than reporting session after session, trying to see which were the things that were really emerging or things that they were recurrent in the different sessions. So the first thing that really caught my attention is that if we have 4 parallel discussions with the 4 different stakeholders, 3 of the 4 stakeholders decided that the focus conversation was on human rights, on how to implement the human rights. And here I have some reflections, because in WAS we've been really working, not myself, but the colleagues, for decades on how to take issues around WAS forward, right? And to learn from the implementation of the MDGs and much before, and now we want to apply the lessons learned to the SDGs. But the human rights is something that has been said 30 times already during this conference. They were only passed not even 5 years ago. So my reflection is that, I mean, we are really, I don't know if Leo is around, but I mean, he's obviously going to have, he should feel the pressure, because all the stakeholders are really putting the emphasis on the implementation of the MDGs through the lens of the human rights to water and sanitation, something that, to be honest, and we all know, it's very recent, right? And Catherine Albuquerque, during her mandate, has been really dealing with the states and other stakeholders, trying to see what does it really mean, because it's very easy to say that water and sanitation are human rights, but we've been in the sector, trying to support Katerina and try to discuss with Katerina what does it really mean, because it's not that easy. So it really caught my attention that we are really going so strong for the implementation of the human rights, something that I think is logical, but I mean, let's see how do we do this practically. In the first session with the colleagues in civil society, I was trying to engage. There was a presentation by Tanzania, which I thought it was really, really interesting, about women empowerment and how well they've done in trying to, overcome the issues. And I was challenging our colleague in Tanzania a little bit about civil society and the implementation of the human rights. What are the roles? Because it was said several times yesterday as well that it is the role of the governments. I mean, when talking about the stakeholders, it is the role of the governments, because governments have an obligation. It's the obligation of the governments to respect, protect, and fulfill. So then I think the other stakeholders and all the other colleagues in the sector trying to support governments, which I think is really important to emphasize, should try to understand what is a real role. And I was challenging our colleague in Tanzania saying, are you not kind of frustrated because you as civil society, you have to do something that is supposed to be done by your government, which is to entitle you with your human right to water and sanitation. It's like, are you not frustrated? Are you not running to your government saying, it is your obligation to give me this, and if you are not fulfilling your obligation, it has to be me as a woman empowering myself or trying to identify what are the means so that I can really get this done if you are not fulfilling this for me. Then also interesting conversations about the human rights with the business sector, because we also have to realize, and it's really, I've been part of these conversations, the colleagues from the Water Mandate know, I've been part of these conversations in different meetings that they have had. And to me, it's still really amazing to see how the private sector really wants to be involved with the implementation of the SDGs, and they are taking the human rights approach as well. That was the focus of their session. I mean, we have to remember that during the implementation of the MDGs, the business sector, the private sector, was not part of the picture. I mean, they didn't decide on what could be an MDG, or they just recently jumped into the picture, and they are really jumping strong with first the respect to the human right to water and sanitation. Yesterday we were told about the guidelines for companies on how to respect the human right. But I mean, people are really asking even beyond. I mean, people want to hear about how the private sector is not just going to respect the human right to water and sanitation, but how it's going to support the human right to water and sanitation, which I think is pretty impressive. I mean, this is really going very quickly. I mean, there were even questions about, challenging the private sector on how are they going to support the human right to water and sanitation. Let's go step by step. I understand that. Let's go first with the respect, right? I understand from the colleagues. A second point that I wanted to make is that I thought it was really interesting, and it will have, of course, an impact for the implementation of the SDGs. It's what it was said during the government stakeholder session, and it was said that public financing is absolutely necessary to reach universal access. And I think this is something also very important, because and also the focus of the conversation was the human right to water and sanitation. And here the issues about public financing have been very much debated, and we have had long conversations with Katerina trying to understand. And it's very clear that the human right to water and sanitation doesn't mean that water is for free. I think Katerina has said that 30 times, and it's very clear in her reports and in the handbook that she has prepared. In relation to this, it was also some important reflections about disconnections, because the poor, once you've been connected, are you really going to be disconnected from your wash services just because you cannot pay? Interesting conversation. Here it was said that it is estimated that 20 billion per year need to be spent to achieve universal access to water and sanitation. And the interesting number as well, it was mentioned that 20 billion are needed per year. However, only middle-income countries are already spending 50 billion per year. So, I mean, how do we make the numbers? I mean, countries are already spending more than what is needed? Yes. But what is the conclusion? The easy conclusion is the allocations go to populations that are already served. this has to be an important consideration. But I mean, of course, it makes sense because existing services need to be, as we have already learned very well, operated and maintained, and that costs a lot of money. Guy Hutton in the session told us that there is an upcoming report that is going to try to bring light to this issue, and we're going to learn more about how much money is really needed for operation and maintenance, etc. But just this also resonated in a comment that I made the first day on how, if you recall, I said that we have more than 1 billion people still defecating in the open, and 3/4 of this population live in middle-income countries. So the conclusion already on the first day was that economic development is not matched by social development. And this is something that it really has to be considered during the implementation of the MDGs. This is a huge challenge. Also, I think it was an important reflection that budgets are not fully spent. And and then another point that I thought interesting, also linked to financing, and this came both from the sessions on civil society and also from the session on academia, is that there is a lot of money that at the end is spent and commitments are made for water and sanitation and also hygiene, but both civil society and academia are asking a little bit for part of the pie, because civil society made very clear that they can really make a contribution for the implementation of the SDGs through issues such as empowerment, transformation, and participation. But this doesn't happen for free. I mean, this civil society is asking for budget allocations as well, part of the pie, because they can really make a good job with this money. Equally, academia said, are you really spending the money well? We can really play a role for the implementation of the SDGs, as they demonstrated during the session, with evidence-based and the possibility of having policymakers being informed by evidence-based. So also, when we are thinking about implementation, just also let's remind that both academia and civil society can play a key role, and this doesn't happen for free. Finally, I thought another interesting point coming again both from the academia and the civil society session, it was the issue of technology and the need to adapt technology to the local reality. This is something that, of course, civil society and academia can play a key role. I mean, who knows better about local realities and what is really needed at the local level better than civil society. Sometimes we come from international organizations and we go and we really have to spend time when we are deployed in developing countries that we don't really know the reality. We need to spend some time to understand what is the real reality, and then partnerships with civil society can play a key role, equally with academia. And then just other 3 key interesting issues that I pick up from the different sessions is by Leo in the government session about something that I think he's going to focus a little bit during his mandate, is about inequalities between the North and the South. And he made a very interesting comment about why in the North sanitation means being really connected to a sewer, while we are talking in the South about just improved sanitation, we are talking about latrines and things like this. Interesting point for me. Also, during the government session, officials from Nigeria made an interesting remark about the need for commitment and political will. I mean, if WASP really needs to achieve universal access during the next 15 years, commitment and political will play a key role. And just another quick theme from the academia session is that we were very much discussing how academia in the South can play a key role also during the implementation of the MDGs. And then it was, I think there was a nice remark about, well, I don't know if it's nice or not, but it was said that, I mean, we need to build trust for the academia in the South. So,
okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Jose. I think this is something that's very common, and we'll hear more about that. You know, this building trust and improving communication and coordination. So, Natalie, over to you. This was a very rich report back on WASH.
Yes.
Is there anything else that you would wish to add?
Very few. So I will just add a few things. So it's been very interesting to be here to see the different facets and opportunities to address the WASH challenges. And And I know we're already working with some of the colleagues here, Thomas and Jean-Marc and UNICEF, very closely on addressing these issues. So there's one thing that WHO at least is realizing, and I think I've heard it a lot here, that we need to take a holistic approach to water, looking not only upstream and downstream, but also at the kind of wider human rights approach, accessibility, affordability. And it's really good to see that it's being taken really quite seriously by countries, but also by the business sector. And there's one thing about the business sector which I noted, and which is interesting. It's identifying those in need. I think it will be a challenge, and to see that it doesn't actually create demand. So if people know that they can get subsidies, just that fine line when there's actually those in need, then those that try and kind of go through the back door to get subsidies. Then, of course, I have to mention hygiene. Hygiene, unfortunately, has been, even over these 3 days, really not talked about so much. I think we can see why, even when we asked 94 countries to see what is hygiene for them and how are they addressing it, we had a wide range of approaches. Of course, there's hand washing, but it's not just limited to hand washing. So water quality for some countries is important, but we even had dental hygiene. I mean, it's such a broad spectrum, and I think we need to put it on the table and just not. It's a bit of a difficult one, but we do need to address it. So the academia also, WHO calls a lot on academia, and I think many of you here as well. We've called upon you. It was very interesting to see their perspective and some of the issues they have. So the training of trainers, I think, was an important issue for them, and something that WHO also is seeing what we can do, or at least what we can highlight to the world about where are the issues, and to kind of break that isolation, especially in academics in developing countries. Jose mentioned a lot about financing. I think we need to make sure it reaches those most in need, that there has been a lot spent, but then we're also asking people to increase the level of service, make it more, increase the quality, but also the availability, the continuity, that it has a high cost. We can't neglect it. So we are asking on one side that there's access, but also this high level of service, and that last step is so costly that, it does kind of unbalance the financing. I think Jose covered a lot, so I'm going to leave it there.
Thank you very much. We didn't talk so much about hygiene maybe at this conference, but I was in the media session, and there was one case study of women and children. They were bathing in a hot spring with very phosphorus-rich water. That's a means of addressing hygiene, but it also leads me over to you, Thomas Chiramba, because you are going to cover two things which you might not know, but you're going to talk a little bit about water quality in ecosystems. This is the theme, but you also maybe can help us shed a little bit of perspectives from Africa, because we will soon, after you, go in to listen to different regions, and maybe you could also just say a few words, on the African perspective of what you've been listening to in the sessions. Please.
Thank you, Joachim. You caught me a little bit by surprise to talk about Africa, because I will do that towards the end. But having said so, I followed this topic on water quality and protection of ecosystems. I must say that there was a lot of talk about water quality, which is good, but very limited talk about protection of ecosystems. That left me with a question as to perhaps why it was like that. Josefina, maybe we might need to reflect a little bit on how we should stimulate more discussion around protecting ecosystems. Joachim, we can't go into the SDG and their implementation without addressing the sustainability dimension. Right. Now, overall, from what I heard, Joachim, I was very. I'm leaving this meeting with a good feeling. Also, in our working group in UN Water, I think we got a lot of very useful ideas that I think we should take forward. With regards to this topic on water quality, and if you may recall, all of you, at the beginning I said that, look, this water quality challenge is as a result of neglect. Not much has been done around it. During the sessions, I was pleasantly surprised, or in fact I learned, that while we're starting from a low level, it can be done within a relatively short time. The examples of Brazil, examples from Korea, even some from here, demonstrated that this can be done within a relatively short time. So within the SDG framework time, much can be done. If you hear the histories and where these, for example, two countries, Brazil and Korea are, but what does it take? It takes governments to be resolved to address this issue, to provide the necessary frameworks, to provide the necessary funding, and of course the incentives for others to work on that. That's what it takes. So that's what the one big lesson I learned. So if there's one take-home message for governments, is that it can be done. We also, like I said, I said it was neglect, and we're starting from low level, but what was encouraging also was that we're not starting from scratch. There are a lot of good examples of tools, platforms, and et cetera, that were raised during the sessions at various levels, at international, regional, national level, and even lower local government level. Interestingly, there were also good examples even for developed countries. One would think in terms of lessons only available for developing countries, but there are many examples, good examples for developing countries for issues that concern them. However, what we learned is that these tools that are there are not always fit for purpose. So we might require to adjust them to effectively move the agenda forward of addressing the water quality challenge. And innovation, as was mentioned, would help a lot. We also learned that governments are not alone in this game. So that is positive in terms of achieving the SDGs. Other stakeholders are available and even willing to play some critical role in the implementation of this SDG on water quality. I learned a lot from the various stakeholders on what roles they could play. But also, one message that came out clearly is that these other stakeholders will not play a role automatically. Some enabling conditions are needed, some facilitation is required, some dialoguing will be required. I'll just highlight a few points. The academia, for example, the way they work, they highlighted, it was very interesting to listen to that session, that if you want to make a career in the academic field, you have to have, of course, peer-reviewed publications. That's how we are promoted. And they're not very much interested in what you call applied research. That does not earn you that much, but you have to do fundamental research. But then, of course, our politicians are more interested in the results and recommendations from applied research. And so we need to engage them and create the enabling conditions. And of course, I learned that they're special species, these academicians. They think themselves as a little bit an elite. So if we want to engage them, we need to think a little bit more. Business, they clearly stated their case that, look, we live in a competitive world and we're profit-driven. We are concerned about sustainability, but please create enabling conditions for us to be able to compete, but also to be able to make profits in the process. So we need to address that issue. Civil society, again, if you want to have labor-intensive construction of wastewater treatment works, if it's going to be labor-intensive, there are some conditions that are needed, some programs, some arrangements that you have to put in place. Unfortunately, in many cases, those arrangements are not put together by water specialists, that are put together by social scientists, others. So we need to reach out to others to come in and help us to mobilize that. Media, of course, they've got their own interests, and I will not go into details on that, on what they want to communicate, but they have a critical role to play to mobilize people, particularly when you want to prevent pollution. If you want to, which is the first thing that should be prioritized if you want to make progress, prevent pollution. Their awareness creation comes in and to report on everything else. So that was very briefly that what I learned, that governments are not alone, but if they're going to have others, they have to create the necessary conditions. There was also a very interesting point that was raised, that water is one of the sectors that is very dominated by governments, and that in itself has hampered innovation. That took me by surprise. We see the huge opportunities that are there to bring in other people, other sectors like the private sector and so on. But of course, government should provide the enabling conditions and all these other things. But there was also linked to that a very interesting point that was raised related to water quality, that strong regulations and enforcement drive innovation for water quality. So that was a point that was raised in that session. And given the strong role of governments, Joachim, what I want to say is that for us to make progress in water quality, it is imperative to have water quality included in the SDG on water. It is therefore imperative that we all work so hard to get that SDG on water. It is that way that we'll be able to make progress to address the water quality challenge. Moving on, like I said, I left with a good feeling from the discussions that I had, but also I was also left with some some homework to do. As UNEP, but also as UN Water, to use our convening powers to bring all these parties together to help to connect the dots. Our convening powers will play an important role. Also, this issue of sharing knowledge, experience, putting it together, I think that's a role that we should think more critical about. And finally, to assist governments to establish the baselines. Like I said, we don't quite know where we are with water quality and what impact it's having, but we can assist them to establish baselines. We can also help them to identify hotspots, particularly when it comes to water quality, ecosystems. We can help them so that they know, and all the stakeholders know, where to direct their investments to get the biggest impact. And to track progress, of course, of the implementation of the SDG and the targets on water quality, and report on the impacts to stimulate more support to reach the target. Thank you, Joachim.
Thank you, Thomas. Again, thank you very much. I'm glad that you are inspired and that you've taken home a lot of lessons. I fully agree that we have to have water quality in the framework. We have challenges. I see big challenges when it comes to the monitoring side. But as you say, we'll have to step up to the challenge. All right, now I'd like to turn to this side of the panel in front, or the reporting back. And we've listened now from the themes, and I'd like to hear a little bit from regional perspectives. And Caridad, maybe I'd like to ask you to start off, maybe with some reflections, what you picked up from what's relevant for Latin America and the Caribbean, please.
Thank you very much, Joaquin. I'm going to, I think quite a few of the things that I'm going to mention have already been talked about, and I think it's just a reflection of those cases coming up and those issues. The first thing that I want to point out as one of the main messages that came out from our session is the issue about inequality. Even though Latin America and the Caribbean is not one of the poorest regions in the world, it's still one of the most unequal regions. So we need to have equality as a guiding principle, and I think water can help us lift these people out of poverty. We need to think about that when we address water. Another important issue in the region is that we have to go beyond thinking about scarcity. Sometimes, and most of the times, the problems and the challenges remain related to governance. We have to keep on strengthening our governance. A lot has been made, but it's still something that we need to address. And Latin America is a region with a lot of water. So we have to start learning how to then go beyond this issue about just thinking about scarcity. Another important topic that we actually talked quite a lot in our session was the gap between urban and rural population. It's still quite a challenge. We're still seeing differences that are hurting our people, and the rural areas need to be addressed in a very specific ways. We cannot use the same solutions that we use for urban population, and I think that's one of the main messages was that we need to think geographically, socially, and economically about these solutions. And I think that has already been mentioned that not all solutions are going to fit everyone. We also need to think about how managing water is also managing conflict. Climate change effects in the region are already being felt, and as these effects increase, we're going to see more and more conflicts between water users. So we have to think that managing water is also managing conflict. Then I'm going to refer to two very interesting points that I heard in some of the sessions. One of them is that we're not starting from zero. We're not starting on an empty canvas. So there has been a lot. The MDGs have taught us a lot of lessons, and I think we need to start from. We cannot forget those lessons, and I think we're starting from a good point. A lot has been made, so we cannot forget that. And another interesting point that I heard in the academia session was that there are also quite a lot of challenges for participation, and that governments need to be bold. I think we also have to allow our governments to be bold and to go really and support this, to give the priority that is needed to these issues. And finally, in our session, one of our panelists, Franz, left us with a very interesting question. In the region, we have almost 36 million people without access to water. We have around 31 million without access to energy, and another over almost 40 million without still going hungry. So we were wondering, are those the same people? And those issues are interconnected. We have to think about water security, we have to think about food security, we have to think about energy security, and we cannot think about one without thinking about the other. So I think those were the main messages that we heard in our region.
Thank you very much, Caridad. If you could pass the mic over the Pacific Ocean, that direction. And we now come to Asia and the Pacific. So, Hong Kong, if you could just give us your reflections also, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think a lot of key points has already mentioned by the previous speakers, and also the Caridad about the Latin America. And also, first, I also want to really express our appreciation for Josefina to have this special regional session in this annual UN Water Zaragoza conference. This is really bring the regional aspects to the global level. And we have quite a good discussion in our session. We have the panelists from mainly from Southeast Asia, and also we have one from Korea, the Northeast Asia. If you look at the Asia Pacific, I think disparity is one of the the key words, because we have quite advanced, developed, countries like OECD countries. There are also quite a lot of LLDCs, and LDCs located in small island countries. So the disparity is really a key challenge for this region, and how regional cooperation can enhance to minimize these gaps and the disparities. On the other side, the urban and the rural, That's also quite challenging for the governments in different countries. If you see the MDGs, if you look at the MDGs, the achievements of MDGs in Asia Pacific, most of the goals achieved, but the sanitation is really challenging. We still think probably even the SDGs, even we still address the sanitation, whether we can achieve these goals after the next 15 years, because there are a lot of challenges. It's not only the money issues, it's not only the concept issues or the governance issues. There are so complicated issues in those areas, especially in those least developed countries or developing countries. So we really think to identify what are the key challenges and how to address this. During the discussion, they also mentioned all this, the legislations, how through the government's efforts to develop or to formulate laws and regulations to support water security. And that include both the access to services and also improve the efficiency of use water resources, as well as how to use economic instrument to support the water resources management and also enhance the energy, water security in Asia Pacific. One of the points we also mentioned about how we use existing tools to do the evaluation and monitoring for the energy water security in Asia Pacific, especially in 2013. We worked with ADB, come up with this water security measuring kind of methodology, which addressed the different dimensions. For example, the household water security index, which is one of the tools we just do the evaluation assessment of the current water security at the household level. So the question from the floor, and I say our participant from Myanmar also mentioned quite interesting. How do you get the data to set up the baseline? For water side, I feel it's really it's a time we come up with a kind of system to collect the data, which will help us to set up the baseline. Probably, the SDGs, now we already started to think about how to set up this accountability framework to do the SDGs. And data could be one of the major challenges. I'm managing both energy and the water. From the energy side, I think at least now we have a few sources we can use for data, like IEA or BP. That's really, we can do the basic analysis, use this water and the UN statistics, use this data from UN statistics. But for water, I think really we need to think about it, especially if we think about the UN water as a kind of institutional framework, how we support to set up this data and to define the baselines. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hong Peng. I think that's definitely a challenge for us. How can we get all the data collection and even now just to develop the indicator framework and make sure that we also interact between ourselves as a water community and the community of statisticians and so forth. Finally, but not the least at all in any means, Natalia, I would like to hear from you. We all like to hear from you on perspectives from your region, ECE.
Thank you, Joachim. In fact, we were the first regional session 2 days ago, so we were the one starting and we are the one finishing as well. In our session, of course, all of these challenges have been already mentioned by all of the speakers, have also been discussed. And the UNECE region is not different from other regions of the world in the sense that we are not talking about Europe, but we are talking about a broader pan-European region. So, of course, we face same challenges in terms of population growth, climate change, water scarcity, and many other challenges. But what came up quite strongly in our session was something which is also a challenge in itself, but also it came up as a tool, and this is about cooperation. And we talked about cooperation really at different levels, starting from bilateral level, such as in the case of Finnish-Russian bilateral commission. We talked about basin level. We talked about cooperation across themes and sectors, and we talked about Nexus. We also talk about cooperation in the sub-region, and I think here, like one of the best examples in our region is Central Asia, and Central Asia is a region where development, not only sustainable, but even just the development, and especially sustainable development, would not be possible without cooperation between the 5 Central Asian states, because they share all of their transboundary resources. So how to ensure these cooperation frameworks and what can really foster cooperation at a local, national, transboundary, global level. And of course, in UNC region, we already have some tools for that, and this is something that we are going to continue building on. We talked also about the UNEC Water Convention, which is a convention on the transboundary fresh water, and also Protocol on Water and Health, where we cooperate across sectors, and we bring together the water management perspective together with health aspects, and there we have a co-secretariat with WHO, which is also in itself, I think, a good practice. And I think we also have, at a global level, we also have to cooperate, and we know that 2015 is a year for global action, where all member states will have to really shape the post-2015 development agenda. And as a UN family, I think I want to refer now to what Thomas said. We have convenient powers, and we have we are supporting member states in this effort, and I think we also have an obligation to communicate effectively and to support countries in an effective way and make sure that the messages we give and when we help to support, for example, development of indicators, to make sure that these tools are simple and practical and will be easy to implement, and will make our development agenda ambitious, but also practical and pragmatic and feasible in its implementation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalia. I'm not going to try to attempt to summarize the summary. But it just a few words. When I spoke yesterday about the first half and the second half of the game, what I feel and what I listening now is, we're approaching sort of the sharp end of the match, as you know, when we're approaching, when it's going to be decided. And the feeling I have, it's not just about that. It's actually what's happening for our planet and our societies too. It's heating up. The competition is getting more and more intense. And we're approaching a situation which is becoming very critical. Critical in terms of risks and disruptions, about interaction between stakeholders, about competition between various users, and very importantly there, we need to ensure that we take a very coherent and coordinated approach, and water is very central in all of that. So I think that all of us have a very important role to play, not only in our professions, but also for the larger picture. So I thank you, all of you, for sharing these insights, and over to you, Josefina.
Thank you very much. I think we have finished this session. I'm happy for keeping time because we have a lot to do today. And we are now going to the next part of the conference, and you will have time for questions and answers, don't worry. And we can engage further with the people who had been in the panel now. So the next part of the day, we are going to be discussing the tools, the different tools. And we are going to discuss